According to its mission statement, Dorcas strives for lasting change for those who live in poverty, are excluded, or are caught in a crisis. In order to make this lasting change, it is necessary to first understand the root causes of the problem. That is why Dorcas started out with identifying the root causes of poverty and exclusion and clustered them into the following 5 categories: negative worldview and mindsets, conflict and violence, natural hazards, inadequate living environment, injustice, and poor governance. The above causes hardly ever stand alone and can usually be found reinforcing each other. Dorcas believes that tackling the root causes of poverty and exclusion will contribute to flourishing people and communities. The organization identified key characteristics of such flourishing people and communities, which are represented by the following impact statements. Dorcas envisions communities where there is a safe and peaceful environment, inclusive access to basic services, and strong and inclusive and dynamic community structures, where people have restored dignity, hope and ability, and resilient livelihoods, and where governments and other institutions cooperate with community structures, support the development of communities, and are held accountable. So how exactly do we get from a situation of poverty and exclusion to flourishing people and communities? According to Dorcas, change can only happen when working at individual, community, and society level simultaneously. Change processes at each level normally happen according to a logical sequence, also called a pathway. Within a pathway of change, the following 4 stages of change can usually be recognized. The first stage, reach and response, describes the initial response to a particular intervention. It often has to do with increased awareness and changed attitudes. Capacity change refers to the stage in which people or groups acquire certain skills and knowledge that are necessary in the change process. The behavior change stage basically indicates how people adjust their behavior in a positive way, based on their new attitudes, insights, knowledge and skills. The benefits stage describes the concrete, longer-term positive gains that result from the changed behavior. These 4 stages can be recognized at each of the 3 levels. At individual level, personal empowerment is the key word, and in this case, the 4 stages in the individual pathway would look like this: I am willing, I am able, I am doing, and my situation is improved. At community level, the focus is on mobilizing the community and building their capacity in order to create an environment able to promote and sustain change. In this case, 4 stages in the pathway of change would be: we are willing, we are able, we do together, and our situation is improved. At society level, it is about calling upon different actors in society that can contribute to an enabling environment for change. The pathway towards an enabling society would include the following stages: others are willing, others are able, others do for or with us, and others improve their services and products. Dorcas identifies a number of generic approaches which provide practical guidance in terms of working at each of these 3 levels. At individual level, it uses the empowerment and life skills development approach. This approach empowers people with the personal skills, values, attitudes and knowledge that support positive behavior and help them to take greater responsibility for their own lives, their relatives, and their communities. At community level, the ABCD approach is used. This approach builds on the assets and capabilities that are present in the community and mobilizes individuals, groups and institutions to come together to build on their assets and to take advantage of existing socio-economic opportunities. At society level, Dorcas uses 2 generic approaches: multi-stakeholder partnerships and advocacy. Multi-stakeholder partnerships allow the pooling of resources, they commit to joint problem solving, deliver mutual benefits, and aim to multiply impact and accelerate change. The purpose of advocacy is to influence the decisions, policies and practices of powerful decision makers, to address underlying causes of poverty, to bring justice, and to support good development. The following figure shows how simultaneous change at the 3 levels contributes to flourishing people and communities. This is also referred to as the Dorcas philosophy of change. At the same time, Dorcas also identified 7 key long-term outcomes which directly contribute to the impact statements. Each Dorcas program has to contribute to at least one of these 7 long-term outcomes. The first long-term outcome is about improved economic resilience and refers to increased income and accumulation of productive assets through increased savings, jobs, and income-generating activities. The second long-term outcome, improved food security and climate resilience, is about households increasing their food security by using improved production methods and climate-resilient agricultural practices. The third long-term outcome, empowered community members, is about people who have hope and an improved perspective regarding the future due to increased knowledge, skills, and self-esteem. The fourth long-term outcome is about basic services being accessible to all people. Dorcas places emphasis on the availability of wash and energy services. In relief settings, this also includes cash to satisfy most pressing needs. The fifth long-term outcome is about setting up community safety nets to support vulnerable people in the community. Long-term outcome number 6 refers to putting a protection system in place for victims and people at risk of harm. This includes providing access to safe spaces, setting up protection platforms, and creating spaces to discuss taboos and to address abuse and its causes. The last long-term outcome is about the government and institutions taking into account advocacy messages and honoring the rights of their constituencies. Dorcas identified a number of important preconditions, also called medium-term outcomes, which lead to the realization of these long-term outcomes. The choice of medium-term outcomes will depend on the specific context of the program. Besides working at individual, community and society level, Dorcas also identified a number of cross-cutting issues that it wishes to mainstream in its interventions. Social inclusion is about removing structural barriers that cause exclusion, especially of vulnerable and marginalized population groups. Gender equality is about both men and women being free to develop their personal abilities and to make choices without the limitations set by stereotypes, rigid gender roles and prejudices. The theme of climate resilience ensures that the wider environmental and physical context of interventions is not only taken into account, but even improved as part of good stewardship. Dorcas also wants to support peace-building processes in conflict and post-conflict communities and mitigate the risk of relapse into conflict by addressing root causes of conflict and restoring broken relationships by fostering reconciliation. Faith at Work reflects Dorcas' Christian identity and its desire to include biblical values and principles into its programs. In addition to these cross-cutting issues, Dorcas developed a particular way of looking at people and communities, namely through a so-called vulnerability lens. Using this lens ensures that Dorcas programs at all times take into account inclusion and protection of the most vulnerable individuals and population groups. So, in summary, Dorcas programs are shaped by its generic approaches at individual, community and society level, by its inclusion of cross-cutting issues, and by its particular focus on protection of vulnerable and excluded individuals and population groups. These different perspectives should always be seen in light of the local context, as this will inform which elements are relevant and applicable, and for whom. When considering the local context, Dorcas distinguishes 4 different intervention areas. Intervention areas are defined on basis of specific challenges and needs encountered by particular target groups in a geographical area. As such, they define the type of engagement with these target groups. The first intervention area is relief, and it applies to people who are in need of life-saving interventions during and in the aftermath of natural or man-made disasters. The second intervention area is early recovery and resilient livelihoods. In an early recovery phase, people are in need of interventions that help them to recover from an emergency situation. The focus is on laying the foundation for sustainable recovery and a speedy return to longer-term development. In resilient livelihoods, The focus is on enabling individuals, households and communities to better mitigate, recover and adapt to crisis, in this way avoiding human suffering. The intervention area Enterprising People and Communities applies to situations where people are resilient to a certain degree, but who want to increase their income earning ability on a sustainable basis. The fourth intervention area is called Community-Based Care and Protection, and applies in situations where particular people are not fully able to lead dignified, active, healthy and secure lives due to age, physical and/or mental limitations or trauma, and are in need of external support structures. Different intervention areas may apply to different target groups in the same geographical area, and in a program more than one intervention area can be distinguished. It should be noted that the boundaries between intervention areas are not always straightforward, but rather gradual and overlapping. Intervention areas themselves are relatively broad in scope, and within each intervention area there are different possible types of responses to the particular challenges at hand. Dorcas has developed expertise in a number of specific approaches which can be linked to the different intervention areas. In relief situations, Dorcas uses the cash and protection approach. In early recovery and resilient livelihoods, Dorcas uses two specific approaches: food security and livelihoods and WASH. In enterprising people and communities, Dorcas uses the employability and entrepreneurship approach and the inclusive market development approach. Lastly, in the intervention area of community-based care and protection, Dorcas uses the community safety nets approach and the future for children approach. In a Dorcas program, we will usually find a combination of different specific approaches, depending also on the context and the selected target groups. Let's look at an example of a program design process. Let's consider a country which has experienced a natural disaster. Dorcas wants to offer support in a certain geographical area where some people are in need of life-saving support, while others need to recover their livelihoods. The starting point is to conduct a thorough context analysis in the area. Dorcas will look at this context through a vulnerability lens, making sure to identify and include extremely vulnerable and marginalized population groups. Dorcas will then assess what kind of intervention areas apply to this context. In this particular case, two intervention areas have been identified: relief and early recovery and resilient livelihoods. At this stage, Dorcas will also assess key elements related to the individual, community and society levels. At individual level, it will look at personal attitudes, skills and capacities of people and potential gaps thereof. At community level, it will look at social capital, that is, presence of formal and informal groups and level of cooperation between members. It will also look at particular assets in the community. At society level, Dorcas will identify potential stakeholders with whom it might be able to collaborate. It may also already identify certain opportunities for advocacy. Also at this stage, Dorcas will look at the relevance and applicability of cross-cutting issues. In this case, 4 cross-cutting issues could be applicable: social inclusion, peace building and reconciliation, climate resilience, and faith at work. On basis of the context analysis, Dorcas will then identify the key long-term outcomes that the intervention will contribute to. In this case, it will contribute to 3 long-term outcomes: improved food security and climate resilience, basic services are accessible to all people, and protection system in place for victims and people at risk of harm. Critical medium-term outcomes related to these long-term outcomes will also be identified. The next step is to identify specific approaches that are best suited to realize these medium-term outcomes. In this case, Dorcas could use the cash and protection approach, the food security and resilience livelihoods approach, and the WASH approach. With this information at hand, program staff can now proceed to design a comprehensive Dorcas program that contributes to the 3 long-term outcomes, that works on individual, community and society level, that works towards achieving key medium-term outcomes by combining the specific approaches, and that mainstreams the selected cross-cutting issues.